Thank you everyone for joining. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have people attending from all over the world, representing a good cross-section of companies in multiple industries and subcategories and regions, of course. My name is Jordan Gint, and I head the Global Energy Group here at MetrixLab. With me today is my colleague, Gil Niv. We tried to make this webinar fun and interesting and entertaining and insightful, and hopefully you'll walk away with some new insights into the perceptions and mindset of consumers today globally on some key energy and energy-related topics.
Well, before we get started, for the benefits of those who may not be familiar with us or know our energy practice, just a very quick introduction. MetrixLab is a leading global research company. We offer a wide array of solutions in quantitative, qualitative, social analytics research. We've experienced tremendous growth in the energy sector, working with oil companies, chemicals, petrochemicals, utilities, and so we created a dedicated group to really offer better service, leverage knowledge and expertise across markets. And we also have a dedicated sustainability practice out of our UK office, and we've been working very closely with them because clearly sustainability and environmental issues are increasingly becoming top of mind in the energy industry. So a little backdrop to this webinar. We've all been seeing dramatic changes and disruption in other industries over the years, and they have definitely made it through to the energy industry. Some key examples we see here in the US in different states, and I think in more countries around the globe, more and more consumers either already have choice or will soon have choice of utilities. They could choose who provides their energy. Just last month, I switched gas providers. Gas prices went very high here before the winter, as I'm sure they have in most other countries for many of you. And the process is very easy, very consumer friendly, no strings attached, very easy to shop and make the change. And you can see which one provides green energy, which one is not. So that's a trend that is clearly changing things in the industry. We'll talk more about EVs and alt-fuel vehicles that are beginning to flood markets in some countries and definitely have a more pronounced presence in many others. That's a threat to the business model of some companies, particularly those that rely heavily on lubricants and fuels, but it's an opportunity for others. We see many new entrants. The entry barriers to the industry are much lower these days as they were during, for internal combustion engine vehicles. And so a threat for one is an opportunity for another. And, climate change, climate impact, all sorts of climate-related regulations and laws, investments, ESG is in the news constantly, which really raises the visibility, makes it top of mind for many consumers. And we think that's a good thing. That will have a positive impact. Last year, we did a similar webinar in the energy space, focusing more on perceptions of consumers about sustainability and what impact effective communication can have on their likelihood to change behavior. And this year, we listened to what many of our clients said is interesting to them, and also selected some hot topics that we kind of wanted to put to the test, figure out if our perceptions match what consumers are thinking and feeling.
So what did we do? We selected 14 key global metro markets across 12 countries. You can see them here on the slide to participate in this study. It represents a wide variety of market development level as well as regions. Now note that the US and China have 2 markets each, but for the purposes of the data that you're going to see here today, these are aggregated to be a total US and a total China roll-up. I will note that given time and space for this presentation, as well as cultural differences on ratings, we're not going to show every data point for every market, for every question, right? But we have a lot of data behind the scenes and would love to share that with you in more depth after the webinar. Let's look first at sort of general sustainability and ESG, awareness, knowledge levels among consumers in this area, and what we can learn from it. Before we jump in, I want to note that for sustainability-related questions in research, consumers tend to overstate or lie about the importance of green issues. As a result, we have a number of System 1 or subconscious non-directive questions that we can do in a survey to try to get around or mitigate some of that bias.
So we looked at the perceptions that consumers have on different brands, both in the energy industry, some leading oil brands, as well as some CPG brands that we used as benchmark. So what you see here in this graph, we plotted the worst and best performing oil brands for each of the markets, and we compared them against a benchmark, which we chose as a leading CPG brand, Coke, in this instance. So for example, and there's a legend for those brands at the bottom. So all the red dots that you see plotted for each country represent Coke. And then you can see how the oil brands perform in relation to them. So not very surprisingly, I would imagine, you can see that in 8 of the 12 countries we have here, the CPG brand Coke, in this instance, the non-energy or the non-oil company is rated higher. In other words, it's rated more positively in terms of its sustainability impact. But if you take a closer look, it's interesting to know that in 4 of the 12 markets, or third, an oil company is actually rated highest, right? And if you look a little closer, you can see that in 4 other markets, the oil company that's rated highest is very close second. So that actually tells us that in 8 of the 12 markets, an oil company is either rated highest or a very close second. One thing that jumped to us and we think is particularly interesting is BP. So if you look at all the green dots on this chart, right, they represent BP. And that's a little surprising because considering, their, big oil spill from 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico that was in the news, in the headlines for months, and was probably a major PR disaster for them. To see them perceived and perform so well in this space is really astonishing and likely a testament for what a very prolonged, focused marketing campaign and messaging can do to a brand. Decomposing this somewhat further, we split this into 2 buckets, right? So we wanted to look at the perceptions consumers have on the contribution that brands may have to their society or community versus the environment. And the question was, is our perceptions about, where brands stand vis-a-vis community and society relatable, how closely they match those for the environment. And what we see here that for some brands, BP, for example, Dow Chemicals, the gap is very small, right? So while for all the brands, perception about their contribution to society and community are higher than they are for the environment, a very small gap for these 2. And when you look at some other leading oil brands, Shell, Exxon, Total Energies, you see the gap is much wider. In other words, consumers perceive their positive contribution to the environment far lower than to society and their communities.
Moving to ESG, we asked the question, does ESG matter to consumers? And the answer is yes, it does. Well, in some countries more than others. So in this chart, we see the awareness on the x-axis, right? With about 1/3 of consumers globally being aware of what ESG is and what it means. On the y-axis, we see consumers claimed impact on their purchase behavior when choosing brands and products and companies to buy from and work with, right? Across many global markets in developing and developed countries, about half of consumers claim that ESG is impactful, right? Has an importance on their purchase or purchase intent of brands and products. Now, it's interesting to note some of the dichotomies here, looking at Australia, which has a low level of awareness and relatively lower impact when it comes to ESG. Compare that to some of the European Union countries like the Netherlands, for example, which is much higher, both in awareness and in impact. And that's a theme that we're going to see throughout this presentation. Even countries that are relatively equally developed have quite different either perceptions, knowledge of certain things, awareness, and different purchasing habits and behaviors.
So let's switch gears and talk a bit more about home energy usage and knowledge of consumers. So as we mentioned briefly before, despite the fact that more and more consumers now have a choice of utility providers, we nonetheless see that the awareness of the energy source that consumers use for their homes is very low. And I don't think that's surprising. We have learned that even consumers, as I mentioned, that live in areas where there is choice of utilities, awareness is still very low to the actual energy source their utilities use. But as you can see, not all countries are created equal here. Brazil jumps as an outlier with significantly higher knowledge, right, of consumers of the energy source. And that's not really surprising. If you know a little about Brazil, you know this country has invested for decades in hydroelectric power as a main source for consumption. Today, almost 2/3 of Brazil's electricity consumption is provided by hydroelectric power sources. And as we included the São Paulo metro area, São Paulo happens to be next to the world's largest hydroelectric power plant. It's just up north from the state. And this is a very widely known fact. It's a source of pride for many people that live in Brazil, around São Paulo in particular. So knowledge there is much higher. Out of curiosity, I wonder if anyone on this webinar knows which country gets 99% of its energy consumption from hydroelectric sources. There's a little chat box there if you want to quickly write. If anything comes to mind, just be interesting to see if anyone knows it. We found that interesting as well. Yeah, so we saw that Norway gets 99% of its electricity from hydroelectric power sources. And again, it just goes to show that not all countries are created equal, and it's really important to understand local dynamics when looking at these topics.
So while we saw that there is generally low awareness or knowledge about the source of one's home electricity, it's interesting to note in a follow-up question that we asked, there is a willingness to pay more for renewable sources of that home electricity, right? And in fact, it's quite high. The numbers that you're seeing on this slide here is the percentage of consumers that are willing to switch to greener energy suppliers or more renewable energy suppliers, even at a higher price, right? So for instance, the Netherlands is, as mentioned before, quite different from Spain, and the US is quite dramatically different from Australia. This is particularly important for utilities, as we've seen in the US, where consumers have, in some places, a choice of power providers. Some utilities go out of their way to promote their clean or green energy sources in order to attract new clients.
Let's move to talk about some of the hottest topics these days. Here in the US, we've seen major transformation with exponential growth, far exceeding prediction of experts just from a couple of years ago. In some other markets across the globe, the change has been even more dramatic. EVs and ultra vehicles either already lead the sales charts or are very close to it already.
So when you look at three fuel types or fuel additives in particular, fuel additives themselves, biodiesel and CNG LNG, which is compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas, it's relatively unsurprising that awareness of specific fuel types and products tracks where they are more prevalent or more popular by country and by region. What you're seeing here is the awareness level compared to the global average for these three types by country. Of course, the blue bars means that these countries are more aware of these fuel types. The yellow bars are those countries that are less aware than the global average for these fuel types. A few things to note. First, if we look at the CNG and LNG in India, where, just for context, 13% of passenger cars last year in India were CNG, and 50% of commercial vehicles sold last year in India were CNG. It's one of the biggest CNG markets in the world. Compare that to the Netherlands, for example, on biodiesel. Netherlands, again, being quite progressive in their knowledge and awareness of alternative fuel types. Right? Two more I'll point out here. One being biodiesel in Brazil for a lot of the same reasons that Gil mentioned earlier, and the fuel additives in Mexico because of partially the elevation, partially the age of vehicles there, also a more lax standards and regulations when it comes to additive concentration regulations and requirements in fuel and gas there in Mexico.
So next we looked at the familiarity of consumers with the different types of alt-fuel vehicles. And as a side note, for the purpose of this analysis, we un-Brexited the UK from Europe. And so the UK is lumped together with other European countries that were in the study. And apologies, if this causes anxiety to anyone. But as you can see, it wasn't really surprising to find that for battery electric vehicles, commonly known as EVs, right, and plug-in hybrids, the familiarity and awareness are higher than other alt-fuel vehicles. But to be honest, we were somewhat surprised that the gap isn't larger, that familiarity levels aren't higher, and that suggests that familiarity overall isn't quite as mainstream as we may have thought. Clearly an opportunity and something that the industry will need to deal with. And of course, as always, when you dig a little deeper into the data, for example, just looking at demographics, we see some pretty significant differences by gender. Men are much more knowledgeable on average than women are, and by age. So people under the age of 45, significantly more familiar than those over the age of 46. And then we ask consumers as a follow-up questions, what's the likelihood of them to purchase for their next vehicle, an alt-fuel car. And number one, and you can see we plotted some of the countries, on this scale. It's interesting to know that the US is close to 65, so almost 2/3, right, of the people said they are likely to consider that. And I think if we had asked this question just a couple of years ago, the picture would have been very different. It's not surprising to see China rated so high. Part of this gap could be attributed to some cultural differences in how people rate and answer surveys over there, but nonetheless, we do expect it to be a leader. There's a major push by the government over many years now to electrify the industry, both domestically and then a very strong export base, right, of old and new manufacturers of electric vehicles. So this does make sense. And again, when looking at demographics, for example, we see that not all countries are equal. It was very interesting to note, for example, that when looking at gender, some markets had very little differences. So China, Australia, and the UK, for example, men and women showed very similar likelihood to consider such a purchase in the future. But in the US, Netherlands, and France, males were significantly more likely to consider such a purchase than females. And when looking at age, here we found much more consistent results across markets, where younger respondents were much more likely to consider such a purchase than older respondents. And that's potentially a real challenge, that gap between men and women in some of the markets I mentioned is an issue that will need to be addressed. We know that women play a key role in purchase decision for vehicles, and the fact that older respondents are much less likely to consider such a purchase is also a problem, because they typically have more disposable income. They're typically more likely to purchase new vehicles than younger people. So these are issues the industry will need to address. And then we looked at what are some of the purchase drivers. Why are people more likely to consider an ultra vehicle? And to make it easy, the green bars represent environmentally related issues. Blue represents financial drivers. Gray represents regulations. And so you can see that across most markets, financial drivers are key, but the gap is not universally as big in some markets versus the others, and there are some outliers. So when you look at China, China actually environmental reasons are significantly more important than financial-wise to most consumers. And then on the flip side, in Spain, somewhat surprisingly, I think, the green motivations are far, far less important than financial ones when compared to all those other markets. So again, just something that would be interesting and important for marketers to note and help with messaging, etc.
So staying on the theme of electric vehicles, we were interested, okay, there seems to be a high purchase intent around EVs in the future. How knowledgeable are consumers about what EVs require when it comes to lubricants, motor oil, and related services? So we asked them simply, do electric vehicles use motor oil? And the left-hand graph, what you can see here is in the green, the percent that were correct in answering this, saying, no, they do not, right? Versus in the red, the percent that were incorrectly stating, yes, EVs do require motor oil. Now, you can see in every country, the consumers were more accurate, right, more correct than they were incorrect. But it's interesting to note that in places like India and the Netherlands, some leading markets for accuracy, contrast that to Brazil, where there's almost an even split of correct and incorrect answers to this question. So some education clearly needs to occur in some markets. Similarly, on the right-hand side, we then ask, do electric vehicles use other greases, fluids, etc.? What we're showing here is actually an accuracy score net, where we're taking the percent correct and subtracting off the percent that were incorrect, sort of that net result. And what you can see is about half of the countries were actually more incorrect on this question than they were correct. On the right-hand side, you have the countries that were more correct than they were incorrect. China, Brazil, Netherlands, France, some of the leaders on this. So it's interesting to see knowledge levels around what EVs require and don't require. So transitioning to the last section here, knowledge and decision-making around motor oil or lubricants themselves. So despite recent innovation within lubricants, and there's been a lot of it, and the investment behind that innovation, things like advertising, claims on bottles, etc., with respect to the molecules themselves, awareness of some of this innovation is quite low. What you're seeing on this slide here is things like biodegradable lubricants or carbon neutral brands or products. Those unaware on the left-hand side and those aware on the right-hand side, broadly speaking, globally, only about a third of consumers are aware of these lubricant innovations. Again, the difference in awareness is striking between Spain and the Netherlands, for example, shows, again, some of that cultural impact and embeddedness of some of the energy innovations and the messaging around them over the past years.
We performed a little trade-off exercise where we asked respondents to tell us which were the most or least motivating items from a set of attributes when considering the purchase of engine oil for their vehicle. And so again, we highlighted in green all the green related attributes. And we were quite surprised to find, as you can see, 3 attributes stand out, right, as being far more important than all the others. And all these top 3, 2 are very green, right? Carbon emission reduction programs, oil recycling programs are really top of mind and about at par with quality. And so not only we thought this was interesting and somewhat surprising really on its own, but when contrasting this with the studies we do annually and globally on the B2B side, so among workshops, garages where they perform oil changes, and we typically interview mechanics, service advisors, etc. We ask them similar questions, and the answers are quite differently. They routinely and consistently across global markets put as highest importance product attributes, the impact of the oil on the performance of the engine, and some key brand attributes, overall perceived quality, how trustworthy a brand is. Sustainability and environmental related attributes are typically rated far, far lower in importance. And so there is this stark difference between what is most important for consumers, what potentially can drive the purchase decision, versus those that actually work in those places they service their vehicles and what they consider to be more important, and probably something interesting for companies in this space to note and potentially consider, how they address it moving forward.
And taking those same attributes and looking more globally, what we find is on those sustainability or green attributes, 4 of them shown here, in certain countries, these attributes rise to the top in terms of importance. So if we look at package recyclability here on the left, in none of the 12 countries that we studied here did this one fall into that top tier being a driver of consumer choice. But oil recycling programs and carbon emission reduction programs did rise to the top and are a driver of lubricant choice across a number of these countries, US as we saw, but also Brazil, France, Indonesia, and the like. So it does vary country to country what the messaging needs to be, what's important for consumers, whether it's on the bottle, whether it's in advertising, because what impacts their purchase decisions does vary market to market. So that concludes the webinar. Thank you very much for joining. We wanted to remind you that if you attended today, you will be receiving a recording of this webinar in the days to come. Be happy to share that or review with you or any of your colleagues. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.